Okay, so again, I want to thank, first of all, Creek Nation, especially Siobhan Agee and John Bieber for inviting me to speak today. A couple of things before we get started. First is that I will use some terms interchangeably, whether it's Indigenous, whether it's Native, whether it's First Americans or First Nations, or if it's American Indian. I know these are terms that are used pretty interchangeably, especially in Indian country, and so you may hear me say one and then the next sentence say the next, but I wanted to bring that to your attention. And then the other thing is, as an appraiser, I am educated in financial values, but I want to emphasize, of course, there are other kinds of values: communal values, historical values, cultural values. And so when I use the word values, I'm mostly going to be talking about the market itself and how, especially in the case of contemporary Indigenous art, values have radically increased. So the title of my paper, People Don't Call It Picasso, a Spanish Painting, Recontextualizing Indigenous Art of North America, comes from an interview with an artist who in 1972 was part of a two-man art exhibition that was sponsored by the United States State Department and traveled both nationally as well as internationally throughout Europe. The title of that exhibit was Two American Painters. One of those painters was Fritz Scholder. The other was one of my heroes, T.C. Cannon. And this quote actually comes from T.C., in which he obviously was highlighting his objection to being labeled, pigeonholed as a native artist. And he simply remarked that we don't call Picasso a Spanish painter. Why would we call me a Native American painter? And so we begin with something that obviously has become pretty standard when it involves any sort of presentation involving Native peoples, Native cultures, and that's a land acknowledgement. We recognize that we are meeting within the ancestral and historical homelands of the peoples of the Southeastern Ceremonial and Mississippian Cultural Complex, the Wichita and affiliated tribes, and the Caddo Confederacy. And since 1856, this land here in Tallahassee is still the legal reservation of the Mvskoke Nation. And just remember that no matter where you are in North America, you are always on native lands. I want to begin by talking about how the market for Indigenous art developed. And that is insofar as the trade routes, because countless Indigenous peoples traded amongst each other in North America, by land, by river and lake, and of course by sea. So that the market for Indigenous art starts with Indigenous peoples. And the very first people to collect Native art were essentially other Native artists. They did so in ceremonial trade centers like Cahokia in Illinois, Moundville in Alabama, Etowah in Georgia. But given that we're here in Tallahassee, I think we obviously need to focus our attention on the one most important to Oklahoma, and that's Spiro. Now, part of the idea of recontextualization necessitates the idea of comparison and contrast. So I want you to stop and think for a moment how people were living and trading at Spiro at the very same time classes were being taught at Harvard University. So, especially for the non-Indigenous population, when we refer to the Mississippian Cultural Complex as an ancient civilization or as a prehistoric site, we really should remember that the division between prehistoric and historic is a troublesome one at best, and always then begs the question of whose history. But what were they trading at these trade centers? We're going to take a look, but before I do want to preface and mention that some of the images I'm going to be showing were burial. However, they were not funerary. Nonetheless, it could be triggering to some audience members, and so I wanted to alert that, bring that to your attention before I just started flashing images up on the screen. They were trading copper coming south from the Great Lakes region and used in objects like this effigy plate. They were also trading shell as far as the Gulf Coast of Mexico and throughout the southeast, used to create objects like this gorget. They were trading obsidian as far south as present-day Mexico, used in objects like this bipointed blade. And they were trading in catlinite, which is the state stone of Minnesota, and came as far south down to Spiro and used in something like this effigy that's referred to as Big Boy or the Morning Star. Now, comparing Spiro and the mountain complexes with Harvard, I believe is somewhat appropriate because people brought their best and most sacred objects and knowledge and placed them at Spiro in an attempt to preserve and to essentially then transmit and share this knowledge with future generations. And in so doing, they employ basically the same idea of, say, a university or a library, especially those universities which house anthropology departments. Now, the history of the academic discipline of anthropology is far beyond what I'm able to do in this paper. However, we should note that anthropology as a science begins with the all-important question of the mound builders, which were initially thought to be a great civilization that preceded and were destroyed by indigenous cultures. Obviously, a very Eurocentric perspective. But what happens at Spiro is both academic and criminal. Spiro sits within the heart of the Choctaw Nation, which was legally deeded to the Choctaw under the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830. The Choctaw, despite promises of in perpetuity, were stripped of their communal property, and individual allotments were distributed as a result of the Dawes Act. But Spiro was located on 4 different allotments belonging to Choctaw freedmen who refused to allow any sort of excavation for years and years, despite the appeals of the gentleman who took this photograph of Craig Mound, Dr. Joseph Thorburn from the University of Oklahoma, who wanted to start excavating Spiro as early as 1913, just after Oklahoma statehood. But by the onset of the Depression in the 1930s, and obviously needing the money, the owners leased the mounds to any number of different bands of mining companies, as well as private individuals who essentially go about plundering Spiro, all lacking in any sort of professional archaeological training and simply seeking the profit off of these looted artifacts. In fact, this 1935 article from the Kansas City Star introduced this article with the editor's note. When Howard Carter, British archaeologist, opened the tomb of the ancient Egyptian king Tutankhamun in 1922 in the valley of the Nile, his discoveries became immediately a matter of worldwide interest. But Mr. Carter was supported financially by the Earl of Carnarvon, the British Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Recent discoveries of an ancient burial mound in eastern Oklahoma may be of almost equal historical significance, but are yet to be recognized by any scientific organization, nor has any museum or wealthy earl come forward to assist. And that with financial support to classify and preserve these centuries-old relics, the mound builders who inhabited the valley of the Arkansas probably before the coming of the American Indians. Again, ethnocentrism just drips off the page. So over the next few years, a number of amateur pot hunters raided thousands of culturally and historically valuable objects located in a hollow chamber or spirit lodge in the mound's interior, containing thousands of freshwater pearls, over 800 engraved and unengraved marine shell cups, stone and wooden statuary, basketry, feather textiles, masks, large copper plates, and countless other items. These objects today sell for tens and even hundreds of thousands of dollars on the market, what is essentially then continuing a black market for Native art. In a desperate attempt to save Spiro, the state of Oklahoma passed the state's first antiquity laws in 1935, and from 1936 through 1941, a joint excavation was undertaken by the University of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Historical Society, the Gilcrease Museum, and the Willow Rock Museum, so that any Spiro material in any other museum collection could essentially be considered stolen art. But these plundered items did not correspond with a Eurocentric idea of art, and as such they were originally housed in collections in Europe of natural curiosities, what would later become the secular institutions of museums. We need to remember that prior to these, the church was responsible not only for the production, but also the determination of what was considered art. And being closely aligned with the monarchy, the church was then responsible for the exhibition of art. However, in the 16th century, indigenous peoples were thought to be something new and lacking the supposed characteristics of European civilization. They were thought to be incapable of producing art. So the objects that were brought back were housed in these curiosity cabinets throughout Europe, such as the one we see here on the screen, Ferrante Impertos del Historia Natural, as well as other European secular institutions such as the Kunstwunderkammern, the Kunstkammerment, and the Gottfried's Kunstkammer. Items displayed in such collections were acquired not necessarily for their aesthetic value, but rather for their supposed rarity and exoticism. Consequently, some of the greatest indigenous art collections are not in the country of their collection or creation, but rather in some of the great museums throughout Europe, such as this Tlingit helmet. Spiro is by no means the first black market for indigenous art. The colonized market for native arts begins with collecting efforts led by the Spanish, the English, such as this headdress at the British Museum in London, this Métis hunting coat in Paris. But it wasn't just the Spanish, the English, and the French, but also the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Italians, the Swiss, the Germans, the Polish, the Flemish, the Norwegian, the Hungarians, Finnish, Austrians, Russians, and even the Filipino. As such, the colonization of North America brought about a diaspora of indigenous art, so that the native art market is not simply a regional or a national one, but rather a global market. And today, indigenous art is collected by museums around the world. Now, we should also note that, of course, not all trade was voluntary, and the majority of early trade took advantage of indigenous peoples, so that countless objects of cultural patrimony have been taken against the will of their creators. But much native trade in the 18th and 19th centuries was consensual, and native nations freely traded their own artistic output with European settlers for tradeware that would be used then in some of their own artistic creations, such as the glass beads used in Chief Blackbird's war shirt, the trade cloth and silk ribbon used in this Osage blanket, and, of course, metal, so that new materials were introducing new objects, and these new objects continued to be collected by both native and non-native audiences. Coinciding with the rise of indigenous trade in the 19th century is a rise in the nascent discipline of anthropology, and as American museums begin to develop, their emphasis on collecting begins to change. no longer thought to simply be objects of exoticism. They were recognized for their quote-unquote anthropological value. More than just about any other museum or institution, the Smithsonian developed its native art collections, understanding them as anthropological artifacts rather than works of art. With the founding of the Bureau of American Ethnology, the BAE, and through their annual bulletins, the Smithsonian sought to collect as much as possible, operating under the obviously false premise that they were in a race against time because indigenous peoples were thought to be a quote-unquote vanishing race. And it is through their efforts that they thought they were helping to preserve history and culture. The Smithsonian and the BAE's influence continued well into the 20th century, so that someone like George Gustav Heye's first acquisition in 1897 resulted in a collection of native art that was the largest in the world, totaling over 700,000 objects by the time of his passing. In 1989, the Heye transferred its collection over to the Smithsonian, and in 1994, 15 years later, the creation of the only national museum dedicated to the works of its native creators, the National Museum of the American Indian. However, we should also note that several other institutions followed, such as the First Americans Museum here in Oklahoma. But we would be remiss to not also acknowledge the influence of another museum, that of the Denver Art Museum, which was founded at the end of the 19th century, but in 1925, when they reinstalled their collections, they did so with their native art galleries, emphasizing its aesthetic value as opposed to its scientific values, thus becoming one of the first museums in the world to start showcasing native art as opposed to native artifacts. Also, that same year, 6 Kiowa painters began taking classes at the University of Oklahoma under the tutelage of Oscar Jacobson. Though Jacobson encouraged their students to paint scenes from their daily life, their instruction was art instruction, not anthropological. In 1928, Jacobson traveled these artists throughout Europe, where their art was juried in the first international art exhibition in Prague to international acclaim. So that the next year, in 1929, their work was published in Paris as Kiowa Indian Art, using pochoir prints that were actually hand-touched by French monks. Lois Smokey, the only female member of the Kiowa Six, attended the university for a very brief time, so that her production is rather limited in comparison with her her male counterparts. But, interestingly enough, the values of her work in many cases succeed that of her male counterparts. The 5 men, however, did go on to successful careers as native painters, including several WPA mural projects, including post offices here in Oklahoma. Contemporary with the Kiowa Six are some other schools that are providing artistic instruction. Bacone College, aka the Indian University, was a university before Oklahoma was a state, and it provided art instruction to students that unfortunately ceased this past semester because of financial troubles that the university is experiencing. At the same time, Dorothy Dunn's studio at the Santa Fe Indian School produced many of the names of artists that we recognize today, such as Fred Cabote, Tonita Pena, Oscar Howe, and Oklahoma's own Alan Hauser. So that the market for native art really reaches somewhat of an apex in 1941 with a blockbuster exhibition at New York's Museum of Modern Art, an exhibition of, quote, approximately 1,000 items spanning 20,000 years of history. The press release for this in the New York Times read that an average of 1,343 people a day have seen the exhibition of Indian art in the United States since its opening at the museum on January 22nd, noting also that only 2 other exhibits had better attendance records, one for Picasso and one for Italian masters. But just after this exhibition closed in 1941, the market for native art would seemingly drop off considerably, obviously because of World War II. And when you stop to consider how many Indigenous artists enrolled in the services and participated in World War II, it's understandable why the market would have declined, particularly the work of the code talkers, such as Narcisio Abeda, Andrew Sinagini, and any number of other, Sinagini, and any number of other Indigenous artists. So that over the next 2 decades, from throughout the 40s and the 50s, the market for Indigenous art is largely sustained by Hollywood and the movies, specifically the Western genre, that not only stimulated popular interest in native art, but in fact demanded it for its set designs, regardless of accuracy, let alone an element of course, white fantasy, such as famous scenes from any number of John Ford's movies in which Plains Indians in full regalia are riding across the picturesque Monument Valley. I would argue that such fantasy actually hurt the market for Indigenous art, and with such media saturation, values actually declined. But things start to change in the 1960s and the 1970s, in no small part to the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, founded in 1962, originally as a high school, and one that T.C. Cannon actually attended. Fritz Scholder was one of his instructors. Today, it is the premier art institute for Indigenous students, a baccalaureate degree granting university that also has master's programs in Native art history. Another exhibit in the 1970s, in honor of the 1976 bicentennial, also helped spur the market, that being one that began actually in London at the Hayward Galleries. Sacred Circles, curated by Ted Coe from the Nelson Atkins Museum. It also set attendance records, and it traveled both nationally and internationally, and this particular work was commissioned specifically for this exhibit, this Charles Hyde totem pole. But just as the market cooled in the 1940s and 1950s, after the 1970s, it begins to cool off a little bit from the 1980s and really into the first part of the 1990s. But it also begins to then rise in the latter 1990s and seemingly peaked in 2006 with the Silverman sale at Bonham's. But in 2008, just as the financial markets fell off a cliff because of the housing crisis, native art also saw some declining values that really don't begin to recover until 2012. But since then, the market has been on a steady, if not also rapid, escalation. Currently, an exhibit like The Land Carries Our Ancestors at the National Gallery of Art is the first exhibit of native art at the National Gallery in over 30 years, and the first one of contemporary Indigenous art in over 70 years. And just this year, the Venice Biennale's U.S. Pavilion was curated by the Choctaw and Cherokee artist Jeffrey Gibson. So that right now, not only is native art having somewhat of a moment, this article, according to Barron's, tells us that it's red hot. And this recent exhibit at Phillips in New York indicates, according to Bloomberg, that prices for Indigenous art have increased over 1,000%. 5%. So, why is the market now seemingly spiking? Well, it's attributable to any number of considerable factors. Obviously, as our planet changes, so too does the availability of natural resources. And an invasive beetle epidemic that is killing off the black ack in the Great Lakes area, as well as river cane that has been reduced by over 98% compared to where it was a century ago, has really forced basket makers to become environmental activists. And it's forcing communities to start farming and planting in ways that are far more sustainable than previously. One project in particular in the Southwest, the Navajo Churro Project, is actually reviving the churro flocks from almost total extinction from when Kit Carson slaughtered them in the March to Bosque Redondo. So what they are basically doing is involving genetic engineering to recreate the same supple, soft wool fibers that were used by their ancestors. Environmental concerns also give way to social concerns, and whether it's movements like Standing Rock, coming to us from the Zoe Ernest Pulitzer Prize winning photograph, Land Back, or MMIW, Indigenous art is elevating social consciousness and influencing the political spheres, so that a growing number of Native politicians and Native nations are increasing their political capital, as well as, of course, their sovereignty, as evidenced by the recent McGirt decision, which ruled that approximately half of Oklahoma is still Indian territory. And just this year, new defs and regulations under NAGPRA require both tribal approval as well as tribal consultation in the exhibition of Indigenous art. So all of these factors end up contributing to a market that is very robust and has experienced sustained growth for well over a decade, driven by the expected market engines such as auctions, galleries, retail, and private sales, but more importantly, it's bolstered by artist direct sales, such as Indian Market in Santa Fe, and of course, the Mvskoke Art Market here in Tulsa. Santa Fe Indian Market in years past has attracted over 500 artists and over 500,000 visitors annually, including museum directors, curators, gallerists, dealers, collectors, and the public from around the globe, providing a unique personal experience that is not possible at the other art fairs such as TFAF, Armory, and Art Basel, which are dealer-driven, not artist-driven. And yet, we have additional organizations that have begun to help bolster the market, such as the Forge Project in New York, which was profiled last year both in the Times and CBS News. It is a Native art-led collective supported by artists directly and lending and donating to things like biennials and museums and other nonprofits seeking to increase the accessibility to Indigenous art and to support institutions that in many cases have begun to become priced out of the market. For works by artists like Chinupa Hanska Luger, a conceptual and multimedia artist who in fact crowdsources many of his projects and installations, such as this MMIW work in which he had people send in clay beads that he used to then create this piece. It's also taken runway fashion shows by storm, such as these works by Jamie Akuma, a beadwork artist who is now regularly featured not only on runways, but in almost, it seems, every single issue of Vogue magazine. Oklahoma's own Yadika Fields is not simply a painter, but is responsible for public art projects across the country, as is an artist like Cara Romero, who is a photographer that actually studied at OSU Okmulgee, the heart of Creek Nation. In fact, one of her works prominently features another Creek artist that we jokingly refer to as the space boy from Eufaula. It also includes non-visual artists, someone like Raven Chacon, a sound artist who was just in the Whitney Biennial in New York and actually won a Pulitzer Prize last year for his symphony, Voiceless Mass. And someone like Joy Harjo, a word and sound artist, a poet and a musician who was not only our United States Poet Laureate, but was recently named an Oklahoma Cultural Treasure. And a film artist who's collecting awards like they were baseball cards. Former student of mine at the University of Oklahoma, Sterling Harjo, who I can promise you taught me far, far more than I ever taught him. But because values are spiking, and as the mainstream really begins to increase its awareness and exposure of Indigenous art, values are spiking, and so too then are forgeries. In fact, this recent article from the art newspaper pointed to the fact that the largest art forgery ring in the history of the world was for an Indigenous artist. And museums around the globe are actually having to go through their own collections and reassess any of their works by Norval Morrisseau. In fact, a town in the Philippines actually changed its name to Zuni so that they could mark their fake fetish necklaces made at Zuni, and thus continue what is a black market in many respects for Indigenous art. These type of fraudulent actions, of course, then force government responses. And we have any number of laws that, of course, affect both the trade and market for Indigenous art. Starting in 1906 with the Antiquities Act, 1918's Migratory Bird Act, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, both 35, 1990, and 2000, and as I mentioned earlier, NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. But I want to call particular attention to the STOP Act of 2022, which stands for Safeguarding Tribal Objects of Patrimony. Because in 2013, several sacred Hopi objects were offered for sale in Paris at Yves Auction House. And when the Hopi tried to get an injunction, the French courts told them in no uncertain terms, you do not exist according to international law. So, the United States government, just as have many governments throughout Europe in trying to create restitution and repatriation from their illegally looted objects, the United States is doing its part to try and keep Indigenous artworks and objects of cultural patrimony in the nation of their own creation. As such, what we are essentially dealing with is the decolonization of the Indigenous art market. And these laws are designed not only to protect buyers and sellers, but to protect our most important national treasures in an effort to curb its diaspora and the market for these works. And in so doing, these efforts help to promote the market for Indigenous art through its decolonization. So, today, especially as we are here at the Mvskoke Art Market, I would leave you with 3 simple words, which I think adequately summarize the market for contemporary Indigenous art. Buy Indigenous art.